let's start. Our first speaker is Derek Jones from Scotland. Welcome, Derek. How are you?
Not so bad, everybody. How's things?
Fantastic. So Derek is a senior lecturer in sustainable design at the Open University. And today he will share with us how the Open University has created the right sort of experience for a student to learn design at a distance. So the stage is yours, Derek. Thank you so much.
Cool. Thank you very much, Francesco, and thank you, everybody. And I will try to share my screen while I do some introductory talking. As you can see, like many men, I'm not very good at talking and doing things at the same time. Okay, can everybody see that okay? And can you see it? Can you still see it full screen?
Yes.
Cool,
Yeah.
perfect. Okay, so yeah, my name is Derek Jones and I'm from the Open University in the UK. That specific location is something that's quite important. I'll come on to that in just a moment or two. I haven't changed what I'm going to be talking about. I'm still going to be talking about the right sorts of experience. That will be the main theme of the talk. I've just refigured the title slightly because I was having a look at the WUD website and there's a couple of really interesting things on there that I kind of hope to pick up on as we go through the discussion today. But we'll come to that in due course. Don't panic. It's still going to be roughly the same sort of thing that I'll be looking at. So as I said, I'm from the Open University in the UK, and that's quite a unique institution. We are a distance learning provider. We don't have a campus where students come to study. We were founded in the 1960s, 1950s and 60s, basically to meet the need of sort of students who fell out of the normal or the traditional educational system. So basically we teach all of our students at a distance. Nobody attends the campus, nobody attends lectures. It's all distance, it's all remote, it's online. It's only very recently that it's actually been online compared to the rest of the history, if you like, of the institution. We are also one of the largest providers of distance education in the UK. So that gives you a sense of the scale of the demand and the need for this type of education, these kind of different spaces of education. And again, I'm hoping that many of you are practitioners as well, I'm guessing, in the audience. So you're going to kind of understand that education doesn't just happen in these like special spaces, you know, tertiary education in the universities and the colleges. It happens in lots of different spaces. And that's something that's going to come through, hopefully at several points in the talk as well. The other point I'm going to make is that we have been doing this for 50 years now. We've actually got a talk on tonight from Nigel Cross, one of the chaps in the bottom left corner of this image. And yes, a lot of people take the mickey out of the Open University in the UK because we were the first to pioneer sort of broadcast on television. Well, not the first, but the first mainstream to blend that into a major or a mainstream learning sort of opportunity in the UK. And it does mean that they were making it up as they went along. They didn't know how do you create the right sorts of experience, if you like, for students to learn when they're not there, when you can't see what's actually happening. And that to me is, if you like, the challenge. And that's the thing that I'm going to be talking about today. The other thing that I'm going to talk about, I'm just going to introduce this really quickly and I'll come back to this. It's this thing that, as I said, I saw on the WUD website. This notion that the aim is to bring HCI and UX together. That seemed a really interesting thing to do, but it also seemed really quite terrifying that there was this separation in the first place. I mean, I've been using HCI and UX terms for a long time now, and I'd never actually really thought about the deep separation between these two domains. So that's something I'd like to touch on later on today. So I'm going to start with this. It's that challenge, and if you're a practicing designer or you're a design educator, you might be thinking, or maybe you're not after what's happened over the last couple of years, how do you teach somebody design at a distance? How do you actually go about that? And the educational philosopher and theorist Donald Schön, he was actually also a business researcher as well. He studied a lot this sort of practice-based learning and education. And he came up with this, the paradox of learning a really new competence is that basically students come into the studio and they don't even know what it is that they don't know. They're so far away from even a basic conversation about what it is to be an expert designer. This is weird because in mathematics, you wouldn't have this problem. There's this complete understanding in mathematics that, you know, you start here, you've got to learn this bit, you've got to learn that bit, you learn this bit, and you build it up and build it up and build it up. In design is kind of like, you see a designer doing all these amazing sketches and then suddenly come up with an idea. It's as if it just happens. It's as if there's no effort to it. It's almost as if there's no specialist knowledge required. It's just creative thinking. And the reality is completely the opposite. To look at a really qualified designer, a really professional and competent designer, it is almost like magic in some ways. So I'm going to paraphrase or riff on Arthur C. Clarke's sort of reference to technology looking like magic here, and say that to a novice, this is exactly the same thing, that when we design, not, as Lawson would say, there's not a lot to actually see because it's all going on in our heads and our imaginations. And then the sketch comes out, if you like, or it doesn't come out. There's 50 sketches come out, but we hide all of those other sketches. We never present to the client the hours and hours and hours of effort that have gone into a design. We only present that last drawing, the nice drawing, the good one that shows all the finished work. Other domains don't hide their work. We do hide our work, and that's a bit of a problem, because it means that people don't take the business of learning to be a designer seriously. They think it just happens in studio, or that you don't have to put as much time into it. And we all know that that's not true, but rarely do we actually kind of think about it. So this goes to the heart of education, and particularly distance education, because we're also teaching something that it's not teachable. I'll rephrase that in a certain way. You can't stand there and say, this is the way you do design, because that's not how it happens. What you can do is demonstrate perhaps a way that you go about something. And what you're really wanting is for the student to come up with their own version of that, okay? This is at the heart of apprenticeship education. You know, this is traditionally where design was, through craft, through sort of close working with experts, all the way throughout history. This has been a primary mode of education, and it's only when this mode of education moved into universities that we started to have a few issues, shall we say, or problems with it. But we need to take this as seriously as any other mode of education. Mathematics might have classrooms. There's a whole bunch of modes of learning that seem to be formal education, and when you go into a design studio in an institution, that can look very different, and that can be really challenging for some education colleagues who don't necessarily look at it and say, this is serious, or this is a thing that you need to take seriously. But this to me is the heart of what we try to do at the Open University. It's that notion of just imagining the novice student coming into the studio, and this is a quote from Donald Schön talking about a studio tutor talking to a student. The student knows absolutely nothing. And it's that idea of getting across the fact that you can't even really talk to them about what it is that they don't know yet, but that what your job is to give them the right sorts of experience so that they can actually learn for themselves. And that demands an incredible amount of trust, okay? That's quite a difficult thing to do. And I'm sure all of us have had negative experiences in design education, as well as really positive ones. This can work really badly, and it can also work really, really, really well as well. So how we go about this, I just need to do a little bit of theory. Don't worry too much about this. There's a TLDR later on, so you can fall asleep for this next bit if you're not interested in it. It's no problem at all. What I always go back to is this. It's the way that we construct stuff in our heads, okay? I'm not going to enter into a debate about the ontology of reality or the philosophy of what is real or what is not real. It doesn't matter whether there's a real world out there or not. We still interact with it, and we still make the real world in our heads, okay? I'm not suggesting that phenomenology is the right way to go about things, but Gaston Bachelard very famously summed it up nicely. I'm an architect, by the way. So again, I get what Bachelard's talking about here in terms of describing buildings, not as walls or rooms or spaces, and not as florid language, sort of like articulation of space and the complex words that architects can sometimes use, but understanding and describing architecture as something that means something to people in a really simple sense. So for example, being in a house is different to being outside a house. I know that sounds really, really, really simple, but sometimes we forget these really, really basic things. There's a feeling and a meaning that comes within in that word, okay? And it's the same with up and down in this example here. When you go up to an attic, that is a different feeling. There's a reason why we use up and down cardinal directions like this to also apply value and meaning, that the cost of something will rise or lower, okay? the way that we attach value to these sorts of things is actually really important, because this is the way that we construct reality. This is the genuine way that we actually form the way that we go about our lives. These stories that we tell us are actually really quite important. And it's all because of this thing. It's all because of the way that we work. We do not work like a Cartesian machine. There's so much research now to disprove the fact that, you know, we look at something in the world, we see it, we just perceive it, it goes into our memory, we do something with it. We don't process like that. We process in a non-linear way, in a very parallel way. There's probably about 20 or 30 different processing systems, if you like, for just looking at something, ranging from understanding how people work right through to sort of shapes and patterns. It's not a linear system. And that complexity, that's what gives us humans. That's what gives us messiness. That's what makes us able to be designers. It means that we can actually look at these different spaces. I'll give you a real tangible example of this, and this is how it relates to online and distance environment. I started my research looking at this thing. So this was a piece of work by some researchers. It was just a side observation that they made, that students were feeling claustrophobic in a virtual learning environment. This was actually in Second Life back in the day. Does anybody remember Second Life? It's going back a few years again. I know it's had a bit of a resurgence, but anyway, students were reporting they were feeling claustrophobia, and they were feeling claustrophobia in a room like this. It was just a blank space, but they'd taken off the roof of the room so that they could see the sky map, if you like, of the environment. And students were feeling, as I say, claustrophobic. And I immediately wondered, well, why is it that students can feel claustrophobic when they're actually physically in an environment that they didn't previously feel claustrophobic? And second of all, what's the mechanism in Second Life, in the virtual space, that's triggering this retelling of reality, this reconstruction of reality that says, and I feel claustrophobic? That's quite a powerful thing when you think about it, that you can actually affect people to such a degree in an online environment that they actually have a physiological response. That's not just anger and irritation, by the way. So when I looked at this, I immediately saw an architectural analogy. The Musée de la Déportation in Paris does exactly this same trick. You go down some very narrow concrete steps and you cannot see the horizon. All you can see is the sky and there's very bleak surrounding concrete walls. And that's intentional. The architect designed it that way to make you feel that way, to make you feel trapped. Now, something happens when you can't see the horizon, when you can't see what's coming towards you. It's a very basic animal thing, if you want to think of it that way. What you can see is the sky. But if you look at the sky, when you see clouds, if you don't have something else to relate the clouds to, you don't know what the scale is. You don't know how far away it is, okay? So you actually become quite dislocated in space. So I understood this feeling, if you like, from an architectural sense. And I'm going to argue that this is precisely what gets mapped in these virtual environments. And this is the reason. It's because of your brain. It's because reality and the way that you think about the world is actually constructed up here, and you take different realities into different spaces. And you do exactly that in online environments. And if you look at any research that's going to come out over the last couple of years, as people have had to transition from physical face-to-face teaching to distance teaching, you will find that 9 times out of 10, they will be talking, or they should be talking, about the breakdowns in human activity, interaction, the values, disengagement, all of these human things. And that's because brains, okay? It's because of the way that we construct reality. The important thing to remember is that stuff in the real world, you cannot just translate it to virtual environments, okay? Because most of the time in the real world, we think that the real world is made up of surfaces, but it's actually made up of stuff we think about. So when we translate the surfaces, and this, again, it's a finding from way back in Second Life, when they replicate university campuses, they wonder why students don't use virtual campuses in Second Life like they use campuses in the real world. And it's just a ridiculous thing to assume that people would, that architecture is just surfaces. It's not. It's about the stories that we construct in our head and the experiences that we have as a result of that, okay? So that's my theoretical pitch. The TLDR, as I say, is that stuff in the real world gets used in virtual spaces, and it's the meaningful stuff, okay? So this, for me, this is where that WUD thing, it was really weird that there is this separation. You know, when you think about it, because for me, interaction is experience, and experience is interaction. It's constant interaction. Yeah, that doesn't matter. So this false dichotomy, I really worry at the fact that we've never actually perhaps properly picked up. Well, I haven't, maybe others have, and I'd love to be corrected on this. My background, by the way, doesn't include HCI directly in UX, so if others know more about this, then please feel free to let me know when we come to the questions. What it does do, though, is this separation allows a bunch of other different things to happen, and we'll come on to those a little bit later on. But usually it's to do with control of domains. It's more to do with politics, economics, the way that people behave. Sometimes it's for good reasons. So, for example, the control of the domain in architecture, for example, you would hope that that's a good reason so that you don't get unprofessional behavior. And I'm guessing the same is true in some other professional domains, but you also get a whole bunch of unhealthy things, and we'll have a look at those a little bit later. I'm just going to give you a really quick example of what we do at the Open University, how we do these right sorts of experiences. Again, just go back to that quote, that experiences for yourself phrase. You could actually sum up what we try to do just in those 3 words. First of all, experiences. So we do rely on a lot of very carefully designed learning material. Sometimes it'll take us up to 3 years to design a course, and then that course will last for about 7 or 8 years maybe. It's akin to almost film production. So we put a lot of effort into designing books, multimedia material, online material, the learning environments, the services and the systems round about which we're going to support it. We put a lot of effort into doing that. And again, I think that was one of the other lessons of the last couple of years where people have had to transition. If you don't have that type of support, then it's really difficult to do it. So we think a lot already about the experience. We don't necessarily frame it as experience design. We've always framed it as learning design, but it basically is the same. And it was only when I was asked to do this talk that I started to unpick and realize just how close the two are. We always start from the position of, right, I need to teach this thing. How am I going to give something to a student such that they might learn it? And you're always thinking about what is the thing that the student's going to do? What's the experience they're going to have? How are they going to make sense out of it? The other thing is the yourself thing. It's no use me giving my experience to students. I can tell students about my experience, but that's not their experience. If they have their own experience, then that means something to them. It means something far more to them. So I can talk about, for example, how you might unpick, say, a complex design brief and how you might actually make sense of something like that. But how a student might go about it will necessarily be different. And we want it to be different because designers don't act completely differently. But there's a similarity enough that at least we're talking about the same sorts of things. So it's that lovely phrase that like but not quite like, that a lot of studio researchers refer to here. This is what's called tacit learning. So we have to design this material such that it's not just one bit of material. It has to be material that can be used in multiple different ways. So yes, we do use multiple modes. We will use writing, we'll use audio, video. Sometimes we'll use what we call adaptive learning, whereby the learning environment does actually change depending on what students prefer or they need at certain times. We try to give as much choice to students as we possibly can, but also educate them and help them learn how to use choice. You know, it's almost how to learn how to learn. And again, I would suggest that there's a really strong similarity in there between particularly HCI and UX design, whereby you are actually dealing with novice users quite a lot of the time coming to a new service, and how you get them very quickly up to speed. I think that's actually quite an important thing. Anyway, here's one of the examples. This is right at the start of one of our early design courses. We still, by the way, we still post out physical material. There's something really quite important about physically being a designer, even if you're going to be working in a completely digital realm. And we do a lot of teaching around about digital prototyping, working in digital environments. But as I said, you know, in the theory bit, if you're bringing physical conceptions to the digital, you need to understand how it is that you translate these. It's not just that you need an online sketch pad. It's actually, you need to know what the sketch is so that you can actually find out what the best online sketch pad is to use, okay? And that's about thinking and cognition. So this is the aim of this pack. It's to give students that experience that here's a thing, you're going to be doing something different. You're going to be doing something, because a lot of people don't realize that you can actually still do in an online and a distance environment. So this is one of the early things that we do. One of the early activities we give them a roll of masking tape. I hope you can see that in the top right corner, top left corner there. This is one of the early briefs that we do. It's one of the introductory activities, and it's make a banana from masking tape and share an image of it on ODS. Just so you know, ODS is our at one of our virtual design studios. It's an online platform. You could think of it roughly as Pinterest for education, way before Pinterest was doing its thing. And it allows students to upload primarily images, but any kind of multimedia content, and then engage in discussion. So it's a way of connecting, if you like, students socially. And that's really quite important for this sort of early task. And students give us bananas. They make bananas out of masking tape. The other thing I should have probably mentioned is that in our current stage 1, our entry-level module, we'll have about 1,000 students studying at the same time. So that's quite a lot of bananas. And, you know, we get a lot of variety of bananas, and that's the whole point. And then we get some people who put a lot of time into the bananas. This is one of, like, I don't know, 10 activities that they have to do in the first sort of few days. So again, you know, we're not expecting them to spend 5 hours on each banana, but some of them do. Some of them completely and utterly bend the rules. Some of them do some incredibly beautiful abstract things. And every single year of this presentation, I've always been blown away by somebody who just goes way beyond anything. This is the point. This is students having the right sorts of experience for themselves, okay? So they've taken this activity and they've turned it into this multiplicity of diversity. And then they've shared it back in an online social environment in our studio, and other students are getting to see what it is that they've done. And so many students make use of this in lots of different ways. A lot of our research is actually looking into how these kind of social learning connections actually happen. This, to me, it's not about what we've done. Like, basically what we've done is this. We've spent the time making up this sentence. We've spent probably like 7 or 8 weeks working and crafting on this beautifully perfect sentence. But the learning is this. It's what students produce. That's the experience bit. That, to me, is what you need to do. You almost need to take your teaching thing and turn it into learning as far as you possibly can. So again, we see students who will look at this studio, they'll look at it for verification. Am I doing the right thing? Students will start to argue about whether or not they're breaking the rules or not breaking the rules. Is that a banana? Is it not a banana? Can you wrap a real banana in masking tape? Does that count? And you'll see students actually starting to do what all designers do, which is negotiate reality and the brief and the constraints and say, what is it that I can actually do in this kind of space, okay? Now that's really, really important. That's at the heart of what we try to do. We flip our teaching to learning so that students can have the right sorts of experiences. And these are the sorts of words that kind of cluster around about the types of activity that we sort of think work really well. And again, I'm wondering, I'd really love to know, as I say, my specialist background isn't in HCI or UX. I've been involved in both, as I say, in different levels. But I wonder whether or not there's a strong synergy between either domain or maybe subdomains in there, particularly in the sense of like these activities. The ones that really work are simple to communicate, but they're still genuine and authentic. They're also still bounded. They have a practical output. It's really easy to see where it is that you need to get to. But they're also slightly complex. It can't just be easy. So for example, it can't just be click the red button and so on and so forth. And I'm guessing that a lot of this sort of stuff, a lot of UX designers, maybe even HCI designers as well, will be nodding along and saying, yep, I get that. That relates to what it is that we are thinking about. So I'm wondering whether or not there's maybe a valuable interaction or discussion that might be had. As I say, that's precisely what it is that we try to do. Everything we do tries to generate the right sorts of experience for students, okay? So I'm just going to end in the last couple of minutes. I just wanted to raise a few issues because I don't necessarily have a sort of ending to this as such. I wanted to maybe just raise some of the ideas. Particularly for us, the challenges in learning are challenges of human challenges. The way our people were around long before the advanced technologies that we're using, but there's a massive tension between people and technology right now. Basically, the last time that humans really changed was about 50,000 years ago. That gives you an idea of the pace of change of evolution, okay? Now, you compare that to Moore's law or what's happening in technology, and you can see that there's a massive challenge between the two. But I think that separating it into people versus technology is problematic, because the other thing about how people change, is that they do because of the plasticity, again, of this thing. We are born to learn, okay? Quite literally. We're born with certain structures that immediately kick in as soon as we are born, to learn language, to understand the sounds of language, to understand a whole bunch of other stuff. So we are born to adapt. And I think a lot of HCI design, a lot of UX design in online environments really makes use of that, perhaps too much, actually co-opting people into the technical systems beyond what people are actually comfortable with. But the bottom line here is that we don't adapt without technology, and technology can't properly adapt without us. So I think more of a synergy between these two things is quite important. I think actually separating them out is actually deeply problematic. And I've experienced this at the Open University when we do design our online services. I've had some absolutely amazing experiences. The negative ones, though, have been when we do this separation. And the separation leads to things like this. And again, I'm being totally and utterly broad brush about this. This is just based on my experience from developing online sort of learning environments. Is that the worst case, we have these types of separation, that we need specification on the one hand, but we also need sort of uncertainty, if you like, on the other hand. We need to blend these two sorts of things. And again, most good HCI designers and most good UX designers absolutely get this, and they don't follow through on this sort of separation. They understand that it is a constant weaving between these two things, these almost two forms or states. But it's just so easy to say that if you're wanting to be this particular type of designer, then this is what you need to do. It's easy to do these sorts of like isolated packaging. There's a reason why, Agile, Waterfall, and several other different methods, if you like, of approach have been kind of successful. And it's because they break up these kind of dichotomies. Where they're unsuccessful is that they don't actually get to the root of the problem. They're dealing with the symptom of these sort of dualistic problems. They're not actually saying, how do we actually get this from the start and do it properly? Again, this is just again from my experience. Just finish up really quickly, my apologies, it'll just be a couple of seconds now. For one of the projects that we did for ODS2, we really engaged with a much broader design team, and we really started to break down those kind of barriers that we talked about previously. And believe it or not, one of them was actually to talk about it, to talk about what we believe and what our values are in each of these kind of different domains and what matters to people. I know it sounds really kind of trivial, but there's some fantastic research that shows with computer scientists, if you ask them, do you think that computation is real or is it abstract? Do you think, if you ask them about these kind of like weird sort of binary questions, you will get a range of answers. Not everybody thinks the same. And I think we bring our assumptions of what people think to design teams. So understanding whether people or not people believe that these things that we're dealing with are real, or whether we're on the value scale, is actually quite important. The other one is definitely be transparent about your drivers. This is really hard if you're working in a professional environment. Again, come from my own architectural experience, I know how difficult it can be sometimes to actually be honest about what it is that's driving you, because most of the time it's time, money, pressure, resource. It's the client pressure. The problems come, though, in every single design screw-up I've been involved in. Problems come where people are not being honest about their drivers, and then suddenly the driver comes out, or what they really want comes out far too late in the process. The other big one I would use cognitive schema. This is a really fancy, stupid word for just saying use human language, okay? So, for example, we use a lot of architectural terms in interface design. And again, I'm guessing that you all do too, but there's nothing wrong with using these. What you're trying to do is you're trying to find a term that's in the middle here, that it's not specific enough, but it's rich enough to give you some way of getting forward. So it's not too vague, not too specific. It's that kind of Goldilocks zone. And then finally, the other one is incomplete design. What I just gave you an example, by the way, I do not mean by incomplete design, I do not mean shipping the beta 17 weeks before it was due to actually go out. That is not incomplete design. That's unfinished, okay? That's just unprofessional. Incomplete design is what I just described with the bananas. You design something and you hope that the user is going to actually augment it and finish it, okay? And that's an intentional and different type of design. And yes, it can take resource out of the actual designed object as well, but you have to be really clever and careful about doing that as well. So that's just some of my experience of how you can actually blend those two sort of dichotomies. But that to me, very much starting on the right, focusing on those things on the right, and then moving to the left is very important if you've never done this before. Okay, just as a final reminder, yeah, it is because brains, humans really are messy, dirty, stinking bags of water and bacteria. Anybody who's worked in an IT help desk understands this, but the problems with technology are not necessarily the problems with the people that you think they are, okay? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Derek, so much for this brilliant speech. Very, very inspiring. So everyone, please don't be shy. Type away your question for Derek. In the meantime, just you speaking about the virtual colleges and why people don't actually use these VR sets. Just let me think about the recent talk there has been about how to deal with an online kind of office, and the Facebook, I think, came up with just having a VR set in an office. I don't know what you think about that. I think we can do a little bit better.
Yeah, I would agree with that. We can do a little bit better. I would actually argue we could do a lot better than that. I think the problem comes, was I say, it goes down to that surfaces thing. Like, see, when you go into a design studio, it's really easy to just look at the studio and say the studio is this big room, there's some desks, there's some people doing stuff, and you describe all the things you can see, or you describe the things you can hear, you describe the things you can taste. Very few people go into those kind of spaces and describe how they feel, describe what the value of the interactions were, because they're focusing on the tangible, they're focusing on the real. It's really difficult to talk about our emotions. It's really difficult to talk about our relations in these kind of spaces. But every success that we've had with online environments, we have never replicated the surfaces. So for example, in our studio, what's replicated, and we didn't even realize this, we've only come to this realizing by observing what students did. So those t-shirts that you saw, those that loads and loads of images, we were unprepared for just how willing students were to share. Now that should have been a lesson we should have picked up maybe from the likes of Facebook. You look at what it is that people actually want to do in these online environments, and you see that these are actually replicating things that happen in spaces, okay? So social connection, comparison, social learning, social contradiction, all of these kinds of things, they already take place in space. Now, if you take that space and you make an online virtual space and you think that you're going to get social comparison happening in that second life space, that's not going to work, because it already happens in places like Twitter, Facebook, and so on and so forth. So again, it's the underlying thing that you need to recognize the translation of. And I don't think any, well, that's not true. There's a few businesses who would be prepared to actually ask. This goes back to this hidden declaration of what is it that you're actually doing when you bring people together in an office. And a lot of organizations and businesses, they're either, they know and they're not prepared to declare what it is that their underlying value is. Like, for example, they want to monitor employees, they want to make sure that everybody's there, or they've got some twisted notion of what it is. Or B, they don't know how to articulate it, they don't know how to say. There's something quite powerful, for example, about serendipity in the meeting of people over coffee or whatever it is in the office. I mean, they put these in clunky terms, but they don't put them in like valuable terms that can then be turned into something that's functional, if you see what I mean. If that makes any sense at all.
Yeah, thank you so much. So let me go through some of the questions that came up. So, hi Derek, thank you so much for your lecture. I agree with you about the essence of language. Spend 6 to 7 weeks in looking for the right sentence, for example, or to be not so specific, ACI, not generic UX. What about students? So what about ask students to write, to define projects before projecting? Do you have some experience in guiding design students in writing?
Yes, absolutely. So basically, I've given you a tiny glimpse of the very first part of our, what we call our stage 1 module. So that's an introductory module. By the time our students get up to stage 3, we expect them to do a longitudinal, a large scale complex project for themselves. So they are writing, they're even being the client, if you like, for themselves. It's really quite open-ended. To be quite honest, it's perhaps a little bit too open-ended, because it does have that kind of, you come up with the idea all, so you're basically engaging in deep innovation, if you like. And that can be quite challenging for some students. So we basically build our students up. If you imagine that little activity, you've made a banana out of masking tape. You've just done a thing. It's just an action. It's a design action. You put a couple of actions together and suddenly you've got an activity. Put a couple of activities together and you've got what we call a design method. It's almost like a mini recipe for ways you can go about design. You put several methods together and you've maybe got a bit of a mini project phase or stage. You see where I'm going with this? You kind of build it up. Again, it goes to the heart of that when I was talking about design being magic. We just assume that students can do projects. I think it's quite important that we actually teach students what a project is, because it wasn't until, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years ago that the penny dropped with me that a project is actually quite a complex thing in and of itself as an architect. And you only ever learn about them by doing them. You never actually talk about how it is that we actually construct projects. Sometimes you might get to do that. I've done that in some of the design practices I've been involved in, where you do actually say, was this the best process we went through? Could we have changed it? But it is relatively rare. I'd like to see much more of that. And I think it does start with education. It starts with like those simple build-up steps so that students can get to creating their own projects. And then getting them to run through several projects, again, because you can't teach project, you have to get students to experience project, because how they deal with managing something over 3 or 4 months will be completely different for each and individual student. And we're all the same as well. You know that project feeling yourself. The new project, this time you're going to do it properly. All the files are going to be named properly. You're not going to have a PSD file that's 500 gig and it's called final underscore final last final. You're going to do it all properly. The client's going to be great. You know that feeling of new project, but students don't. They've never been through a project and then come out the other end to know the messiness of the project, to then feel the feeling of new project. You see what I mean? So they have to have that experience as well. So we are putting a lot of time in just now. We're actually refreshing our qualification into actually questioning all these basic assumptions in design, like how you design, what a project is, how you construct a project. And we're going to try to take it a bit more seriously and give our students the tools to actually work on those sorts of things, as well as the domain specific sorts of things. But it is a challenge. I'm not going to deny it. The project thing can be a challenge, particularly at stage 3, where we have lots of different drivers from lots of different students, and it can be very difficult to try to maintain it. One of the secrets that we do have of the Open University, and this is a weird thing, not a lot of people know this, we still have a tutor system, okay? So we're still based on like an old Oxford and Cambridge University model, which is that one tutor will be responsible or have a group of, between 10 and 20 students. So even though we have 1,000 students, we have a lot of tutors who each have a tutor group. So you still have that space within which you can have one-to-one dialogue to coach for projects. And again, this is the other thing that we do. A lot of it's automated, a lot of it's online. We can do a lot of stuff at scale, but we still have these human connections, these human values, these touch points, because they are so important. And projects are a classic example of that. You can't just say, do the project and assume that students will get on with it. You do need these kind of moments. And it's kind of like uncertainty and interface. You can't assume that because you've described this interface or designed this interface that everybody's going to use it the same way. Anybody who's done any user research into interface use, you must have come across those users who have just done completely unpredictable things, completely weird things with it. And that's precisely the same with students as well. So, yeah, so that was a bit of a ramble. Maybe didn't get to the heart of the project answer there, sorry.
No, it's absolutely great. Thank you so much. So if we don't have any more questions, yeah. So dreaming, what do you think should be the goal to be achieved in 5 years with respect of this topic? So it's a broad question.
That is a really tricky one. It really is. Because this is one of the problems of me talking about this stuff, and the difference is doing it. Making a change, basically this problem, this separation particularly goes way back to the 1950s and 60s. I take it most of you know Brett Victor, used to be one of the lead HCI, UX designers at Apple. Watch his stuff, just read anything or watch anything by Brett Victor. I'm just completely with him on almost everything. computation and computer science could have gone one of two ways back in the 50s and 60s. It could have been seen as an augmentation of human cognition, or it could have become, you know, a positivistic science that just focused on the machinery and the objects of computing. And unfortunately, it chose the latter. And I think that's a real loss to humanity, because it's the difference between, you know, whether you think the world is digital or whether you think it's made up of fuzziness and valves. And the problem is we went with the digital option, and it creates a massive bunch of separations between how we think and how we believe the world is. And I think just now there's far too much of a dominant position with respect to technology, and it's not recognizing the value of the human cognition bit. And I think it would be good to move more into that space, and not just to co-opt human cognition into things like AI, recognition, all that type of stuff, but to actually see messy human cognition as a function of computing, or indeed a mode of computation in itself. So one of Brett Victor's ideas is that we actually step back from technological development in terms of just looking at faster, bigger, better, but actually looking at the application of it. That 50,000 year thing, that really matters, because that plasticity is still quite slow. We still don't have good paradigms for using basic computers. Some of the best models I've actually seen of the overlap between human cognition and computation have come from really, really old hardware, just being used more effectively, more efficiently, better, and in different ways. Brett Victor's example he gives is that computers should go back to being the size of a room. That is, they should be a room. And that as we move in a room, as we move objects about, if we're designers, as we're moving sketches about, that computation is taking place in the background as a passive activity that can become an active activity. That type of thing would be lovely to see. Now, in the next 5 years, in that short-term horizon, it's going to be really difficult to get to that stage. I think the more we could actually break design teams down, and particularly with graduates, the more we can introduce graduates to the value of human and fuzzy and cognitive thinking, the better. But that we do it in a really competent professional way, not just to say, oh, it's really nice to be creative, or it's really nice to be complex, but actually take seriously the cognitive ability that's required to manage creativity, to hold creativity. And similarly for creative professionals as well. And we're starting to see this in some courses, to expose them to computation, to harder, more analytical methods very early on. Some lovely work coming out from particularly architecture schools over procedural sort of geometry development, and how that can actually really cross over these fields. So that would be my big one. If we were going to affect it in the short to medium term, it would be those transdisciplinary or cross-disciplinary sort of ways of working in education, and where possible in practice as well. That would be the two big things, would be to infect those two spaces.
Thank you so much. So let me thank you again for this brilliant speech. So have a great day. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Francesco.
Thank you. So if you want to share your thoughts about Derek's speech, check out our social media pages on Facebook and Instagram, and please comment and use the hashtag WUDMilan. So let's see who's next in just a couple of minutes.